Hello, and welcome to our Monday Supper Show. I'm Camille Vasca, and this is my husband, Mike, who's getting all of our family's votes for Attorney General this year. If you're a registered voter and you haven't voted yet for Mike, I hope you'll do so tonight. On tonight's show, we'll talk about the Defund Police movement with former Washington State General Rob McKenna and former King County Sheriff and Congressman Dave Reichert. Mike will discuss with Rob and Dave what our state government should be doing and saying about this movement, especially our state's chief legal officer, the Attorney General. And we'll talk with the publisher of the Lynnwood Times, Mario Lotmore, about the tactics groups claiming to be part of the Black Lives Matter movement used this weekend to intimidate Seattle Police Chief Carmen as they invaded her suburban neighborhood in Snohomish County. If you have questions for Mike or for our guests, please post them on Facebook or in the questions section of our supper live stream page. We'll get to as many as we can tonight. Now, I'll turn it over to Mike.
Thank you, Camille, and hello, everyone. Welcome to our live stream. Today, the Seattle City Council postponed a vote to defund the Seattle Police Department until next week. The council says its defunding plan is responding to protests for racial justice that have arisen in our state and around the country after the tragic death of a Black man, George Floyd, in the hands of Minneapolis police. The movement for racial justice is as important now as it's been from the time we first became a nation. We have made so much progress, but the death of George Floyd shows we still have a long way to go. The Seattle City Council admitted it has no plans for how to defund the police and provide justice for all people, whatever their race, which is what the protests are seeking. So the vote today, or the postponement, was a bit anticlimactic, and we'll see what the council does next week when the vote is now scheduled. I decided to run for Attorney General because I saw our justice system under attack, and yet our current Attorney General said nothing and did nothing about it. Since I announced my campaign in late March, these attacks have accelerated on courthouses, on police stations, and on the police themselves. As I've talked with leaders and voters from across the state, they've told me they are very concerned with what's happening in Seattle, and they want the state to get involved. Seattle needs our help, they've told me, and we don't want these ideas from the fringe of politics to spread. As your next Attorney General, I will not sit idly by as justice is attacked. Today, we'll have a conversation with former Attorney General Rob McKenna about why the state, and in particular the Attorney General, have critical roles to play in defending our justice system and in the discussion about defunding the police and pursuing racial justice. Rob, thank you for joining our show. Are you with us?
I'm here. Thanks, Mike.
Okay, great. Good to see you again. And we'll also talk with former King County Sheriff and Congressman Dave Reichert about what he sees as the state's role and how he thinks defunding the police will impact our efforts to improve racial justice. And Dave, thank you for joining our show again as well. Are you with us?
I'm with you, and thank you for having me. And hello, Rob.
Okay.
Haven't seen you for a while.
I'm not sure Rob heard you, but Dave says hello.
I did. I just had myself muted to cut out the airplane noise in the background when Dave was speaking. But Dave, great to see you as well. Really good to see you.
Rob's on his deck, making us all jealous. Well, let me first ask you both what you think about the defund police movement generally and the direction the city of Seattle seems to be taking on this issue. Let's start with Rob and then with Dave.
Well, I think it's really disheartening. For one thing, it completely ignores all the reforms that have been occurring with the Seattle Police Department over the last several years. Reforms that have been supervised by a federal judge. They've taken a lot of effort by police officers and leadership. And frankly, to a large extent were needed. I think that a lot of the changes they made were changes that needed to happen. But all that's being lost now because a bunch of people have decided to substitute a plan for reform with a percentage. And that just doesn't work. It's become a test of left-wing political correctness to say you want to cut the Seattle Police Department in half, when a poll that I saw reported just today says that 68% of Seattle voters think that's a terrible idea. They oppose it. So I'm really discouraged because I think the protest movements we've been seeing, the peaceful protests, have been bringing up important messages that people deserve to be heard. Reforms are needed in many departments in this country, but the Seattle Police Department has been making change and doing good work. And I think that's getting lost in the furor and in the marches on the police chief's home and other topics we're going to discuss tonight.
And next, Dave Reichert, you were an elected sheriff in King County, which meant your office was in downtown Seattle. So you spent a lot of time downtown. What do you think about the defund movement and how Seattle is moving in that direction?
Well, I agree with everything that Rob said, and you know, the Seattle Police Department and for that matter, police departments, sheriff's offices in Washington State are some of the best trained, compassionate people that I know in law enforcement, not only across the country, but across the globe. And of course, most people know I joined the sheriff's office in 1972 and left in 2005. And the progress we made in connections with community, the progress we made in training and conflict resolution has been tremendous during those years. And after I left, it's now been 15 years, more progress has been made. And Rob makes a great point that the progress that's been made up to this point will all be erased as we defund, not to mention the fact that law-abiding citizens are going to be left to defend themselves, to protect their property, protect their families, and keep their own families safe. So that, to me, it's going to be a very unfortunate result, to say the least, when families are forced and put into the position of protecting their own homes. If you want chaos, I guess the direction to go is defund the police department, close the jail, and according to Dow Constantine, and don't charge people with crimes, according to Dan Satterberg. So we're obviously headed in the absolute wrong direction.
Let me ask a follow-up, Dave Reichert, on that. Do you think defunding the police will help, or will it undermine the stated goal of racial justice in our cities and in our state?
Well, you can already see the disintegration of society and the separation. That division started years ago and was very noticeable. I'll go back to 1999 during WTO, and groups came in, infiltrated peaceful protesters, anarchists from around the country, divided our city, divided the politicians, and divided our community. That was the beginning of actually where we are today, in my opinion. So as we look back, it's been a slow process, in my opinion, that people have continued to chip away at law and order, at police officers, and being, and police officers want to be criticized. They want to get better. They want to improve. But you've got to have the support of your elected officials, the attorney general, the governor, the mayor, the county council, and the county executive. They've got to be standing with you as you stand up to protect the rights, constitutional rights of every citizen that lives in your community.
And Rob McKenna, let me ask you that same question. Will defunding the police, will it help or will it hurt the goal of providing racial justice in our cities and in our state?
Well, it won't do anything to advance the cause of racial justice because first of all, there's no correlation between cutting a budget and achieving justice. Secondly, implementing reforms in police departments take resources. Third, ask yourself, who's going to benefit the most from, cutting half of the police budget, half of the police officers? It's going to be the anarchists. It's going to be the people who want to be able to go out and commit crimes and reduce the chances they're going to be caught. There will be no more resources to investigate property crimes. Those are low enough as it is here. That is to say, the resources are low enough. Property crimes are high in Seattle. There won't be resources to pursue fraud investigations. The police will have to perform triage and limit their work to, going after murderers. They'll be so constrained in terms of the tools they have that there's no way that they're going to be able to protect the communities that are most frequently victimized by crimes of all types, including violent crimes. Those are communities that are lower income and often communities of color. So, I would challenge anyone who believes that cutting the police department in half or cutting any police department's budget significantly in our state correlates to greater justice. Show me the evidence that that's true. It doesn't exist.
Some of my Seattle friends who are quite liberal believe that what will happen if police funding is cut is that wealthy neighborhoods will hire their own private police, and that's how they'll maintain the level of policing necessary to stay safe. But of course, poor neighborhoods can't afford to do that, and that will create an even further disparity. Before we get into our main discussion about the state's role in all this, I wanted to talk a little bit about the aggressive tactics, some have said intimidation tactics, Black Lives Matters and other groups have used on those who don't agree the police should be defunded. These groups have protested outside the homes of Seattle's Mayor Jenny Durkan, 2 city council members who would not sign on to the defund police idea, and this weekend at the home of Police Chief Carmen in Snohomish County. To describe what happened in Snohomish County this weekend, we are joined by the publisher of the Lynnwood Times, Mario Lotmore. I can tell you as a former board member of an online newspaper, Crosscut, how tough that business can be. I'm so impressed that Mario has created a true community newspaper. Hello, Mario, are you with us?
Hi, can you hear me?
We can, yes. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate sharing the story.
Looks like you have story ideas on the whiteboard behind you there.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. So,
okay.
So let me get into what transpired yesterday. Actually transpired on August 1st. So the incident occurred on around 6:50 on August 1st, 6:50 p.m. on August 1st. About 40 vehicles came to the area. They were parking along the road, and the road it's a dead end road. So the vehicles thought, they were pretty much driving down. It's about a half a mile road. They were driving down and just keep on making circles and started parking on the side of the street. So one of the residents noticed this, that when she was leaving, she saw these vehicles, and then she saw that people were dressed in black hoods. They were in black masks, and black shirts that said Black Lives Matter. And residents told me that they were because they knew that Carmen Best lived in the neighborhood, they were already hyper vigilant to make sure something wasn't going to happen to her home. And so she alerted other neighbors, and then neighbors came out and asked them to pretty much leave because they were blocking the roads. They then perceived, and some of them left, but they didn't leave. What they did, and this was about 40 vehicles. So that's, by the way, this neighborhood only has about 20 homes in it. So just keep that in mind. Okay. And so they went down the street. I'm not going to say the name of the location, but they went down the street to a burger joint, and they parked their cars there, and then they left their vehicles and proceed to walk down the street again. So the neighbors originally set up a perimeter to stop the vehicles from coming back. But then about 200 protesters left the vehicles at that location and then went and started marching towards Chief Best's home. They were then met by another set of protesters that were not protesters, residents. These were neighbors, guys. So closer now to Chief Best's home, probably just about one or two houses away from her house. And they circled her home and blocked the road there. And that's when they confronted, but that's when they saw people had duffel bags. Now, there were about a few protesters that were there, several dozen there, but there were other protesters, as I said, about the other 200, so I would say roughly 150 plus, were walking around the neighborhoods. And what was pretty chilling was they were shouting profanities. A lot of the neighbors were telling me this, and I deliberately didn't want to incite anything, but they were shouting profanities and racial comments at the neighbors that were there. They were also taking pictures of all of the homes. They were taking pictures of of the license plates of vehicles. They were going and approaching, and this is what was pretty chilling and terrifying to a lot of the residents, because it's a very family-oriented neighborhood, where they were approaching kids, little 8-year-old kids, and asking them what school they went to as an intimidation tactic. That actually pretty much touched a nerve for me. I would admit that really did. And then they had walkie-talkies on them. This is all from what was told to me. They said they were well organized. They had each of the vehicles that were there had numbers in them. They said they were taking and putting placards on them, identifying their vehicles. They didn't understand why they were doing that and marking their vehicles. They all had walkie-talkies. They were communicating by walkie-talkies. They all had cameras out and filming everything and shouting at people and saying, "I got you on film," or trying to incite them to get a reaction. Then they did approach. Then they had duffel bags with they said large duffel bags, and in the duffel bag, they didn't know that was in the duffel bags. And so they, when the protesters that approached Carmen Best's home had the duffel bags, and when they were asked to show, the contents of the duffel bags, they refused, which they legally have the right to refuse, right? But that's when the guys were like, "You're not going any further," and so they left. By 7:45, the crowd pretty much dispersed. By 8:30, the sheriff was notified. And sometime after 8:30, I do not know at what time. I failed to ask that, so I apologize. But sometime that night, Carmen Best spoke to each of her neighbors in person and apologized. And the neighbors told her that, they feel that they actually had sympathy towards her, that it's not her fault. So she was trying to apologize to them for inconveniencing their lives, but they didn't see it that way at all. And the neighbors were they told me they were very grateful for Carmen Best even coming to them and speaking with them, but they were very grateful that they could band together and support a fellow neighbor.
Our newspaper, the Lynnwood Times, did an outstanding job of reporting this. You were kind enough to send me the story this morning, but I understand it's gotten a lot of attention around the country. I understand you went to the neighborhood the next day and to do a little follow-up reporting. And I'd be curious to know what your sense of the community was the day after.
So I went there Sunday. It was hot yesterday, guys. I won't say that much. So I got there around 3:00. I was there from 3 until I think 6:30, probably. I walked. I parked. When I went there, there was a sheriff vehicle there. I asked the sheriff if it was okay for me to park my car. I showed him my press pass. And I had a physical copy of the paper with me. So I had that so he can know that I was true press and I just wasn't someone snooping around. He told me, he said I just couldn't park right in on someone's yard, someone's property. So I pulled over, I found an area at the end of the street and I parked. I knocked on a few doors, spoke with some people to find out what went on. Everyone wanted to protect the privacy of Chief Best. They were at first very hesitant to speak with me, at least the first group of neighbors I spoke with. I then spoke with the husband, wife, that's what, they told me what transpired the day before. They were on edge. They thought that I was actually had nefarious, I had ulterior motives, let's just put it this way. But after they saw who I was, and breaking the ice, they knew my intentions weren't nefarious. I then continued walking down the street to other neighbors. And then as I walked, then a group of about 12 people showed, literally, they just showed up out of nowhere. And they weren't armed or anything. They just showed up and said, "What are you doing? What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm a reporter." And they saw, even though I had my badge on, and they saw my notebook, and they thought that I was taking license plate numbers. And so they said, what are you doing? Are you taking license plate numbers and this, that? And I said, no, I'm just a reporter. And to de-escalate, I just said, here's my book, here's my notebook. And he looked through it and he was like, oh, and then they apologized and they were like, oh, okay, well, we don't really want to talk about anything. And but some other people after that came and spoke to me, but when they were in the group setting, they didn't want to really share anything. And I think they felt sorry because I was really hot and sweaty because I had to go up and down a hill. So, and then I came back to my vehicle, but the neighborhood was pretty much on edge. Everyone was very alert, hyper vigilant is the best way of putting it, which is unfortunate.
Mario, your newspaper is running an online poll about whether it's okay for protesters to go to public officials' homes. Can you tell me what you're learning from that poll, at least as of this evening so far?
Yes, right now I'm bringing it up. It is, I think I know I had over 500 votes. And right now we have 518 votes and 81. So just so to be specific, this is the language of the poll. Does protesting at the private residences of elected officials advance or undermine movements pushing for social change? So far, out of 519 votes, 81% say it undermines.
Thank you, Mario. This is Mario Lotmore from the Lynnwood Times. And Mario, let me give you a chance to plug your website so people can go and check out the great coverage you're providing, not only on this story, but also on the elections.
Yes.
His newspaper has done a series on many of the statewide elections. Again, a really impressive effort by a relatively new online newspaper helping to inform the public. What's your website?
My website is www.lynnwoodtimes.com. And I would like to add that I was one of, I think, maybe the only newspaper in which almost all the gubernatorial candidates, that at least the top 5 that have raised money, has actually responded, and including Governor Inslee, to the questions, and also the lieutenant governor candidates and also the attorney general candidates. So, and those have gotten over, I think, 8,000 hits each.
Great. Well, thank you, Mario. We may come back to you in a few moments. The day after these protests at our house, Chief Best wrote to the Seattle City Council saying they are out of line, the protests, and go against every democratic principle that guides our nation. She said, before this devolves into the new way of doing business by mob rule here in Seattle and across the nation, elected officials must forcefully call for the end of these attacks. Dave Reichert, what do you think of these tactics and Chief Best's request that elected officials forcefully speak out against them?
Well, she's absolutely right. I mean, so far we haven't seen Governor Inslee say anything. As far as I've been watching the news, reading the newspaper articles, et cetera, following the media, and I haven't seen any words from Governor Inslee or the Attorney General. And I think both of them should be partnering together to give a strong voice from the state capitol saying enough is enough. And if you commit a crime, you break a law, commit a crime in the state of Washington, you're going to be held accountable, responsible, and you're going to be arrested. This will not be tolerated any longer. Look, if the governor can fine small businesses because they may not have exactly adhered to the 6-foot rule, or somebody's not wearing a mask, he can fine those people, but he can't speak out regarding this violence. I think that the police chief was hamstrung in the beginning. I believe in misdemeanors matter. I believe that in the broken windows theory. So what's happened here is we've allowed these anarchists, Antifa, apply whatever adjective you want to those groups. We've allowed them to kidnap the real message of reform, and we've separated the two groups that could solve the problem of police reform and community involvement, which is the initial group who spoke out and said, we want justice and we want fairness and equality in the system. and the police department. Those are the two groups that want to come together, that recognize that there needs to be change. But this group that has kidnapped, again, that message, and now blamed this entire, the violence that's now occurring in Seattle on the police department. And if it hadn't been for the police, this would have never happened. That group is allowed to operate freely. And so what you'll see as we allow them to do and continue to do what they've been doing for months, they're going to get more and more bold, and they're going to go to other elected officials' homes. They're going to commit additional crimes if we don't stop them now. And our state officials, our local elected officials, all need to stand in support of the police department, the sheriff's offices in this state, and say enough is enough, and we're going to enforce the laws to protect the peaceful protesters and the law-abiding citizens. Everybody else that's out there on the street, you're going to jail. Now that's an old cop talking.
Not that old. Well, now to Attorney General Rob McKenna. Rob, you and I have talked about the role the Attorney General should be playing in the debate about whether to defund the police. And now I'll add to that the role he should play in calling for the end of these intimidation tactics against public servants. Can you tell us what you think the Attorney General should be doing right now?
Well, he should be speaking up. I mean, there is no statewide elected official who has a role in law enforcement and public safety other than the Attorney General. The State Patrol reports to the governor, so they're not really allowed to say anything. The only year-round voice for public safety and law enforcement in Olympia, if he chooses to exercise it, is the Attorney General. It's a job and one of the roles that I had that I took very seriously. And I think it was effective. We were able to do a lot of good work to combat problems like street gangs and methamphetamine labs and the like, because I played a leadership role. And it doesn't mean that I wouldn't criticize law enforcement in particular instances where I thought there was a mistake made. As Dave said, they want to hear the criticism. They want to get better. These are very conscientious, hardworking public servants, whether they work for the state, a county, or a city. So the AG ought to be stepping up and saying that intimidation tactics are wrong, whether that's marching to the home of the chief of police or to the mayor or to the city council member, ought to be saying that defunding the police department is a terrible idea that will be counterproductive, and ought to be pointing out obvious truths. Let me give you an example of what I mean. When you look at the left in this state, in this country, what are some of the things they hate the most? They hate borders, and they hate firearms. Now think about what you saw at the border of the CHOP or the Chaz, the area of Seattle that the city allowed to be taken over for several days. There were no police there. The East Precinct was vacated. You had people who just they dug up the park, did whatever they wanted. And for a lot of it was peaceful. At night, not so much. People were killed. But what happens when the police leave? This is a microcosm. This is a story the AG ought to be telling. You end up with the guy standing at the edge of the CHOP with a firearm, demanding to see people's identification. In other words, enforcing the border around the CHOP and requiring people to show ID until they could get past him to get to their apartment or to their business. That's what was happening. And that's what happens when you take away law enforcement. People decide they need to arm themselves. And if you don't live in a neighborhood with the resources to hire private security, you're going to go out, you're going to buy your own security. And people are going to get hurt in the process when we have that proliferation occur of people just trying to protect themselves.
We've got a question from Sean via our website. This is for both of you. And so, Rob, we'll start with you, and then Dave, follow up with you. Sean's question is, why does there appear to be such a disparity in how Democrats and Republicans approach public safety? And I don't know if he's talking just about our state or if he's talking about national issues. So you can interpret that how you want. Rob, let's start with you first.
I think when we're talking about issues of whether to cut police department budgets in half, there isn't a disparity. The overwhelming number of Democrats and Republicans and independent voters all recognize that as a terrible idea that will be counterproductive. There's no disparity there. We can have disagreements over how big police departments should be. I'm of a view that they are under-resourced in this state by and large. Seattle already only has half the number of police officers per capita that Boston does, for example. We can have those debates, but there is no disparity between Republicans and Democrats and unaffiliated voters when it comes to how bad an idea it would be to cut the Seattle Police Department budget in half.
Dave Reichert, how about you?
Well, in my years of service, I found the same thing that Rob just talked about. It doesn't matter if you're a Democrat or a Republican. Your main purpose in life is to protect your family, protect your children, make sure they can go to school safely, make sure they can walk down the street safely. So Democrats and Republicans alike, and I've been doing a lot of work in Central America since I left Congress, and the people in Central America all want the same thing. So it's not what country you're from, it's not your ethnicity, it's about family. So when your family is threatened, you depend upon the police department. And we talk a lot about that thin blue line. And now some people describe that thin blue line as a division between cops and the community, when in fact, what that thin blue line means is that that's the line that police officers stand on. Whatever color their uniform is, they stand on that line, protecting you and your family from those bad people and bad things that are happening in the world. And Democrat or Republican, people want to protect their family from those bad people and those bad things. When I was the sheriff, I worked with Rob when he was a member of the county council, and we worked together to find solutions to issues around law and justice, including the entire criminal justice system. When Rob was the attorney general, we worked together, continued that work together as on some of the issues that Rob mentioned earlier. That's the sort of atmosphere that we should be looking for today, that collaborative atmosphere where the attorney general steps up and says to the sheriffs and police chiefs, why don't we have a meeting? I'll be there with you. Maybe the governor, if he has the courage, will come along too. And we'll sit down and talk about how we can bring some safety and security to the families, because this neighborhood that was just described by Mario is now living in fear. That has changed that neighborhood forever. Can you imagine the 8-year-old children or child who was contacted and the other children, what they're thinking today and what their parents are telling their children as to how they might have to operate in coming days ahead?
Rob, your former chief deputy in the Attorney General's office, Brian Moran, is now the U.S. Attorney for the Western District of Washington. He called the Seattle City Council's plan to defund police alarming and reckless, and said if you like what you saw in the CHOP, then you'll love a police department that is defunded by half. Is Mr. Moran showing the kind of leadership that you would expect from our Attorney General?
He's showing the kind of leadership which motivated me to promote him to be the Chief Deputy Attorney General in the 5th largest Attorney General's office in America. He had been the Chief Criminal Prosecutor in the office. He was hired for that role by my predecessor, Attorney General Chris Gregoire. Prior to that, he'd been a longtime Deputy Prosecuting Attorney in Kitsap County. This is a man who is deeply, deeply committed to public service, to the rule of law, to our Constitution, and he's a really fine lawyer to boot. And, I'm not surprised at all that Brian is stepping up and filling the vacuum left by his former boss, and I mean Bob Ferguson, because he was so good at his job that even though the chief deputy usually changes when the new attorney general comes in, Attorney General Ferguson asked Brian Moran to stay on as chief deputy, and he stayed in that role until I lured Brian away to come work with me in the private sector before he returned to government service as U.S. attorney. So, Brian is the kind of leader that we should be seeing. He's presenting the kind of leadership we should be seeing in the Attorney General's office right now.
And Bob Ferguson has shown that he will speak out on some justice issues. For example, he has launched a review of police use of force cases to check for possible conflicts of interest. And in Bob's first term, he advocated for legislation to increase penalties for assaults at courthouses. But when actual assaults occurred at the King County Courthouse in Seattle during his second term, forcing judges to close the main entrance, Bob Ferguson said and did nothing. Rob, why do you think Bob Ferguson refuses to speak out in defense of our justice system when it's under attack, at least in his second term?
It's because defending the criminal justice system, defending law enforcement, speaking up on public safety issues has become politically unpopular with certain elements of the Democratic Party, particularly with the far left. And what you have is a party which is now dominated in its internal discourse by the voices that say police are bad, public safety is overrated, law enforcement budgets need to be cut. Neither Bob nor Governor Jay Inslee nor any of the other leading state Democrats in Washington state have said a word. I don't think you've heard Patty Murray say anything about it, or Maria Cantwell, Pramila Jayapal. None of them is speaking up and saying, "Hold on, not so fast. This is really getting carried away, and we need to find the right balance between public safety and the goals of achieving justice, including racial justice." None of them is doing it, because to say a single positive word in favor of law enforcement, or even to suggest there might be two sides to the story, would bring them under attack from the most extreme elements of their own party.
Dave Reichert, as a former King County Sheriff, what do you see as the role of the State Attorney General in addressing the defund police issue specifically, and in the conversation about improving our justice system more generally? And I know you answered that to some extent by talking about bringing people together, but do you have any more thoughts on what I could be doing as the next Attorney General on this very important subject?
Well, and I think Rob mentioned a couple of things too. I think, first of all, the Attorney General needs to come out and make a very strong statement against what's occurring here in the state of Washington. And second, I would convene a meeting with the law enforcement leaders, the State Sheriff's Association, WASPIC, and others. The Attorney General should be sitting down with them and helping them find a way forward to reconnect and connect with the community. In fact, the law enforcement agencies may be able to help Bob Ferguson reconnect with communities. That might be a better way to phrase it. As far as his inactions regarding, his comments about attacking courthouses and not doing anything, I think the last conversation that I was in, we talked a lot about leadership, and leadership is more than words. Ferguson can talk about and help pass legislation that sounds good, but if you don't step up and back up the act of promoting certain legislation, back up your words by supporting the law enforcement, your words and the legislation you support don't mean a thing. People are still now living in fear, while the governor and Mr. Ferguson are in hiding.
That's former King County Sheriff and Congressman Dave Reichert. Thank you, Dave. Rob, back to you. I want to thank you for all the advice and guidance you've given me and our team in our campaign for Attorney General. We'll close this last Monday supper of the primary election season by asking if you have any other advice you'd like to share with me and our viewers about what comes next.
Mike, I think you're doing a great job of bringing attention to the issues we've been talking about this evening, and to a lot of other important issues as well. So obviously, I want you to, keep campaigning hard, as I know you will, and your family is, to get the word out. I mean, you are exhibiting the kind of leadership that we desperately need back in the Attorney General's office on these issues. And you'll be the kind of Attorney General who will reach out and use the convening power of the Attorney General's office to bring people together to solve problems. When I became Attorney General and wanted to take on the meth epidemic, I looked to Congressman Dave Reichert, former Sheriff Dave Reichert, and the leadership he provided on the meth issue. I think, Dave, the very first big conference in our region on meth was one that you organized back before I was elected AG. And I modeled that. I took it to Olympia. We put together a working coalition of Republicans and Democrats, lawmakers and law enforcement. We passed a comprehensive meth bill that tackled meth labs, provided more drug treatment for people who are incarcerated and addicted to meth, and took a really well-rounded, balanced approach to protecting our communities from that scourge. That's the kind of leadership that we need in the AG's office. I know, Mike, that that's the kind of leadership that you will provide. And for all of your supporters out there, it's really important that they get the word out, that if they didn't think it mattered before who wins this election for Attorney General, they ought to be very, very clear about it now. Because now we have a choice between you, I think, after the primary on Tuesday, and an incumbent who is just going to remain silent and fold his arms and say nothing about the crazy nonsense that's being spouted by the far left, things that 2/3 or more of Democrats don't support, much less the rest of the voters in this state.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Rob McKenna, Dave Reichert, and Mario Lotmore. And thank you all for watching our show on this eve of the primary vote. I've been so honored to be a candidate for Attorney General these last several months. I got in the race to defend our justice system, and it's clear to me now that we can't wait until after this fall's elections to get going. If you haven't done so already, please go to our campaign website and put your name on our petition to defend justice. That's www.mikevasca.com. I'm also running for Attorney General to use my decades of experience as a professional attorney and a community leader to bring people together so we can address the big challenges our state faces, like homelessness and lawlessness, helping small businesses survive COVID-19, and to be an independent watchdog over state government. We've talked about so many big issues on this show: the state's response to COVID-19, racial unrest and riots, the CHOP, one of the largest heists in history by Nigerian cybercriminals from our state's Employment Security Department, reopening public schools during a pandemic, and the list goes on and on. We've learned a lot together. I have learned so much from our guests and from you, from our friends, supporters, and our viewers. Governor Dan Evans told me when I decided to announce my run for Attorney General during the state's initial lockdown order that there is no playbook for running for office during a pandemic. Well, with your help, we've written that playbook. Tomorrow, we'll find out how well it's working. If you haven't voted yet, please consider voting for me tonight, and don't forget to drop your ballot in the mail tomorrow. Thank you again for being part of our team to protect the Evergreen State. Have a great evening.